Hey everyone, it's the Our Shawn. Welcome to another edition of McBride Attorney's Law Show. This show is about you, the business owner, business leader, and we invite other lawyers and other legal experts on to talk about legal issues which are probably impacting you. Today I've got Anessa Santos joining me. She's an attorney in the Orlando area, and we're going to talk about a question we get a lot, which is what state should I form my company in? And so it's an interesting question, comes up a lot. We'd love to hear what your thoughts are, what you've heard from other people. So just drop comments below wherever you're watching. You might be picking us up at the McBride Attorney's Law Show on YouTube. You might be picking us up on Facebook, one of our LinkedIn feeds, wherever you're at. Drop us comments. Let us know what questions you have, what issues you have, and we'll see if we can address them in a future show. I always remind you we can't give you specific legal advice for your situation on the show. For that, consult the lawyer of your choosing. But we're here to give you some general ideas and talk about it a little bit. So, Anessa, let's just cut to the chase. What state should I form my company in?
It depends.
It depends. That is the answer, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, this has been a great episode. Thank you. No. All right. So let's dive into this a little bit, folks, and let's talk about what it depends on and what it's all about. So, big thing I hear about people is, should I form my company in Delaware or Wyoming or whatever so I can save a bunch of taxes?
Yeah, let's role play a little bit here. Yeah. I'm springing this on you, of course, right?
Of course. It makes it more fun.
I'm going to, it's very spontaneous. I'm going to play the client.
Okay.
Okay, you be my lawyer, and we're going to walk through what happens in our respective offices like every week.
Every week.
So, Shawn, I've got this great new business idea, and, I'm here in Florida and you're in Florida, but I want to incorporate my company in Delaware because, Shawn, that's where everybody incorporates their companies if they want to be taken seriously, right? I need to incorporate in Delaware.
Right, and that's usually the first thing we hear. And so,
so what are you going to tell me?
Well, so the next question becomes why? Why are you looking at Delaware? What specifically is going on with your company?
Because everybody incorporates in Delaware. The whole planet incorporates in Delaware. So if I want anybody to take me seriously, if I want to attract investors, I need to incorporate in Delaware, right? Because investors won't invest in a Florida company or a Nevada company or an Ohio company. Isn't that right, Shawn? I have to be in Delaware.
Not necessarily, yeah. So my next question is always, how many owners do you have? What does the ownership of your company look like? And what type of investors do you want to attract? Who's going to be investing in this company?
Why does it matter what my ownership looks like?
It makes a big difference. So, one thing is whichever state you go to has what we call the internal affairs doctrine. So we're governed by local law. If we're in a situation where we have one owner, we have a primary owner, it's not as important. If we start having a fractured ownership where we have a lot of people owning the company in small percentages, it may be very important where we're incorporated. Delaware has a dedicated court system. I do use Delaware in some cases when there's a likelihood that we could end up in litigation.
So talk to me about what internal governance means, because most of my clients, right, we need to have this conversation where I do this, right? Yeah. I talk to them about the clubhouse rules for how they operate their business, and then I talk to them about the business of operating their business. And so how, why does it matter what statute governs company is operating?
Well, we have 50 states, and every state has some version of corporation law, and every state has some version of an LLC law, right? So we can use those entities in every state. What the lawyers have figured out over the years, and what generally applies, because there has been some challenges to it, which is your affairs of your company will be governed by the laws of the state you form in. So,
what are the affairs of the company?
Meetings. What do you do as far as dividends? How do you have votes for different matters and issues that come up? Right? All these types of things will be governed by your state law. And then it also gets into some really technical stuff. What happens if somebody doesn't like your decision as a person running the company? What happens?
A minority shareholder, for example?
Shareholder, right? That will generally be governed by the laws of the state that you're incorporated in or your
Are the laws, do they vary dramatically from state to state?
They vary some, and enough that sometimes it makes a difference, sometimes it doesn't. Delaware has, years ago put in the idea that you can waive fiduciary duties. I've used that provision, meaning that if I represent the person that's running the company, right? Another thing that always comes up as a lawyer, you may have heard of us talk about on the show, is who do I represent, right? I'm always looking at which pair of glasses do I have on.
Mm-hmm.
Do I represent the company, which is kind of everybody? Do I represent the majority owner? Do I represent the minority owner? Who am I looking out for, right? I got to pick who I'm at bat for. Who's my team?
Mm-hmm.
And as a lawyer, that'll make a big difference in what decisions I make. It may change a decision, such as which state do we want to be incorporated in, right? If I'm representing the team, and I've been in this case, if I'm representing the majority owner of a company who's running an LLC, and maybe it's a joint project with a couple of companies and there's a bunch of money in there, I don't want to be challenged about my decisions, right? So one option I have is to go to Delaware and get an effective waiver of fiduciary duties and take that level of care down so that now I can run the business as it says in the LLC agreement and be much less likely that somebody's going to sue me because they don't like my decision. That becomes an important consideration.
Mm-hmm.
So I've got to look at all the facts and circumstances, right? So I've used that before. I've had a time where I had a company, it was a, multi-million-dollar project, and my client was going to be running the project, and they wanted to run the project without having to worry about if the other person didn't like some stuff down the line, they would get sued. So we put it right in the document. Everybody knew what we were doing, but it basically made it very hard to sue my client because somebody didn't like their decision. That's an option we have under Delaware statute.
Mm-hmm.
So there's some fine points that'll make a difference. But those are fine points. In many cases, where somebody comes to you and they have one owner, and no investors, a lot of times you'd be crazy to go to Delaware in that situation, right? Because now you're bringing in another state. Now you have more taxation. You have more filing fees. You have more paperwork to do if you ever move the company or merge or any of that. I mean, you've got to have a reason. So that's kind of the starting point is, what are your reasons? What's going on in the business? And then you can start making a judgment based on that.
Now, what's really interesting is that several years ago, in conversation with a company in California, they wanted to be sort of like a conservation-minded entity, and their initial question was, where do I register? And they obviously wanted to register in Delaware, which begs this whole question again. And so I did some research to see just how relevant is Delaware to being the key jurisdiction nowadays. And I had read this really interesting article. It was quite lengthy, written by a couple of Harvard business law professors. And what was really interesting is that they argued against favoring Delaware over several other jurisdictions. And one of their arguments was that the law now is just so voluminous coming out of Delaware that it doesn't really leave a lot of room for creativity, and it can be stifling towards some of the newer type of emerging technology companies that are coming out, right? Because it's just so rigid now, it's so highly overregulated. And in addition to that, they stated that, the statutes pertaining to the operation and governance of corporations and limited liability companies and partnerships and limited partnerships and whatnot had been revised to such an extent that where there wasn't a great deal of meaningful difference between the nuances in governing your company in the state of Florida or Texas or Nevada versus Delaware, right? And so, one thing that I constantly advise my clients is that if they're not operating their company physically in Delaware, that they also have to register their company as a foreign business, right? Operating in the state where they are operating. So let's say, for example, they're here in Florida and they incorporate in Delaware, but all of their operations are happening here in Florida, right? Their principals are here, their activity is here, their main business address is here, whatever it is. Now they've got to go to the Secretary of the State of Florida website, sunbiz.org, and they have to register as a foreign limited liability company or a foreign corporation doing business. Now all of a sudden you've got two registrations.
And you gotta pay somebody to have an office. Most of these people don't have an office in Delaware, so you gotta pay somebody to maintain an office in Delaware. So yes, you're not going to avoid the local taxes, right? A lot of people think this is a tax dodge, right? Like, I go form in Delaware, then I don't have to pay tax in my state. No. If you're operating in that state, if you read your state laws, basically all the states, and it's a little different for everyone, but if you've got operations happening in that state, you're going to have to file with the state to do business in that state. And if you don't file, you're going to have a nasty surprise later.
Now, let's say there is a dispute
Mhm.
And the non-Delaware state doesn't really have any law that talks about the facts and circumstances of that dispute.
Yeah.
Won't that court then look to Delaware as a potential solution that they might apply? You know, if
Well,
there's a solution in
yeah,
Delaware.
the issue you have is if the state you're in, well, yeah, okay, so I mean, if we're talking about getting into a really technical corporate fight, that's where we worry about these issues, right? Is if we have a technical corporate fight, the minority shareholder doesn't like what happens.
Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of times they're going to look to Delaware, but the problem is you've got kind of a crapshoot, right? So, I mean, one thing I like about Delaware, of course, I'm a Delaware lawyer. I spent a lot of time up there, so I kind of understand how it works.
Which is why I wanted to have this conversation with you, because hardly anybody can say that, in all honesty. You know, for attorneys practicing law, Delaware is a teensy-weensy little state, and for you to have like actually physically been there practicing law, running back and forth to like the Delaware business courts, you're a great resource on this.
Well, I'll tell you what happens in Delaware, and this is one thing that does make Delaware, in many people's opinion, a little bit better than other states, is the legislature, it's a small state, 600, 700,000 people, whatever Delaware is at now. So a tiny state. The lawyers get together every year and they look at where the problems are. What court cases come out? What are we reading that we don't understand? A new issue came up because people are doing something new and we don't understand how it works.
Mm-hmm.
And the lawyers get together and they send the proposed laws down to the state legislature. And every year the state legislature passes the amended laws. So Delaware law, if you look, every June 30th is updated every year.
It's really current.
Texas, huge state, right? I practice in Texas as well. Huge state. The legislature meets every other year. They're busy, right? I mean, you've got 30 million residents in Texas, and they've got really a lot more going on than worrying about the Texas Business Organizations Code.
Yeah.
So Delaware, 40% of their state revenue, last I checked, is coming from corporate filing fees, the taxes on these foreign corporations, other stuff. It's big business, right? They're going to make sure they get it right. A state like Texas, it's important, but it's not central to their government. So just a different philosophy. So we see that. And then I always tell people, what judge are you going to draw, right? So, in some of these other states, we don't know what judge we're going to draw, right? And that judge may or may not know much about corporate law.
Which is why it's the attorney's responsibility to advise them and bring in that persuasive law from the state of Delaware, or maybe from the state of Wyoming. If you're a digital currency company.
you're getting a lot more uncertainty because this judge, may have been handling, a property case over who owns the cattle on Monday, and then on Tuesday they got to figure out whether you violated your fiduciary duties as a corporate director, right? I mean, you can see how you don't really have that channelized, specialized knowledge, whereas Delaware has a court system that's really set up for business cases. So you get a judge.
Pertinent to that is that the parties to the dispute will be required to get on a plane.
Yes.
And go there.
Yes, they will.
Travel costs and everything that's in association with that. So that's something important that I advise my clients as well. Now, let's say that folks that are listening have decided that they're willing to risk Delaware, law, assuming that it's favorable, be applied persuasively to their case in their state where they're registered, right? And so they want to go ahead and move their company from some other state to their home state of Indiana or Nebraska or whatever they are. So that would be potentially a corporate conversion. We didn't used to have corporate conversions available. We used to have to do like a merger and acquisition, or we'd have to wind this company down and start this company up. And now we have this nifty vehicle called, the corporate conversion, which we can also do with limited liability companies. So we can literally just kind of pick up our company and move it to the state that we want it to be in. Or maybe they've decided that, hey, I'm really concerned. I think that Delaware law, I've researched it. I see this issue maybe looming in the future. I want to move to Delaware. Right. So talk to us about these business conversions and when and how they can be applied.
Yeah, they're generally available. You have to make sure both states allow them, right? So that's one thing. You're talking about two states' laws. So they both got to agree that you can do this. Most states have adopted conversion statutes, which say you can move from A lot of times it basically says you can move from a corporation to an LLC, you move from an LLC to a corporation, or you can also move state to state. So it gives you that great flexibility where it's become a lot easier than it used to be. We used to have mergers like you talk about, or wind downs, or all kind of other structuring to do it. Now, in most cases, if you get two states that have conversion statutes, and I believe most do now, it seems like the vast majority do, you can convert back and forth. So you can move these companies pretty easily. Not to say there isn't some technical challenges with it. I would definitely say, unlike some people can a lot of people form their own company the first time without a lawyer involved. And you can file this LLC certificate or a certificate of incorporation and probably figure it out. You may have some buried issues, which is why I don't advise people to do that either. But the conversion, you need to be very careful because you got to get the two states to agree. And there's some very interesting issues that can come up filing. So, we as lawyers, I usually, what I do call pre-clear, because, there are forms out there for certificate of formation. There's forms out there for certificate of incorporations. These conversions, the forms really need to be tailored to the two states in play, because you got two different sets of laws that are in play. So they're not voluminous, right? So we have to make sure we get it right. So we lawyers can step through a process where we basically take the form to the state, say, will you bless this? Will you accept this if we bring it to you? The state comes back and says, yes, we'll bless it. Then we can do the conversions down the line. You can get in a very ugly situation because remember, you got to file this conversion in both states. If you mess up your paperwork, if you don't say the right things in the right order, the right way to make the person, the administrator at the state happy, you can have in a situation where you've converted in one state, but you haven't converted in the other state.
Right. So now you're like in limbo land.
You're in limbo land. One state thinks you're gone or whatever. The other state thinks that you're not.
Right. They still think you're at home. So
right.
I think another issue that it's important to bring up too is that if you're converting like say from a limited liability company taxed as a partnership to a corporation, well, the IRS doesn't accept partnership taxation as applied to a corporation. So no matter how you're converting from an LLC to a corporation, vice versa, or from state to state, there can be IRS notifications that are required.
IRS notification. The other one sometimes people trip up on is their foreign qualifications. We talked earlier about foreign qualifications. Basically, the general rule is if you're doing business in a state, you're going to have to do a foreign qualification. I've seen people that have converted out of one state into another state. And then what you got to do is you got to go back to the first state and you got to file as a foreign company, right? Because you continue to operate in the first state.
Yeah.
Because when you converted out, they thought you ceased operations. You're going to have to go back now and refile. And it caused an interesting issue with one of my clients because legally it was the same company. They changed their name as part of the conversion. So as part of this conversion process, you can also not only move your company, but simultaneously, if you so desire, a lot of times you can change your name.
Yeah.
So my client said, great, well, we're going to move out of state A, we're going to move into state B. And while we do that, we're also going to change our name to a new name. But if you read the statutes, legally it was the same company, right? I mean, even though the name changed, the state changed, under the laws, it's supposed to be considered the same company. But then they had to go back to the first state, file as a foreign company with the new name, and that caused a lot of confusion on that because it was technically legally the same company, but it had a different name and a different state of formation.
Yeah,
so that's why you want to get a lawyer in the middle of this so you can sort this out with them.
Communication with the state is key. Absolutely.
Right. And a lot of times
with the IRS, because you got to notify the IRS of everything that you're doing in this regard.
Right. Great people usually at the state, good. You can find good people at the IRS. The problem is, there's so many people and, unusual situations. It's hard to get them coded in the computer correctly. So you got to start that communication process of moving it around.
Now, how do I know when I need to register myself as a foreign company to another state, right? So talk to me about the Irs Contacts Test and what the IRS requires, right? So we think about what the state requires, but we also have to think about what the IRS requires, because if either of them require that you register, you qualify yourself as a foreign company operating in that state, then you got to do it.
Right. Well, basically every state's got their own statute on what it is. Most people have gone to, there's been some court rulings about interstate commerce and what we call nexus, which is do you have a connection with the state? So basically, the states are looking for a connection with the state. So if you're showing up enough, if you have people in the state you have employees in the state, you have a warehouse in the state, you're selling regularly in the state, these types of things, if you start reading the rules, these are the types of things that are going to trigger. So think regular connection. Certainly, if you're keeping an office in a state, every state's going to say that you have nexus with them, right? So you got to file as a foreign company. If you've got employees there, so you hire somebody that's working in that state, that's probably nexus for purposes of it. So really, if you're doing something regularly on an ongoing basis, odds are that state statute's going to say that you have nexus there. So you got to do a state-by-state analysis. But for the most part, your back of the hand rule is, if I'm regularly in the state, if I have somebody regularly in the state, if I have a building in the state, I'm going to have to file in that state.
Mm-hmm.
Company, and then that triggers all the tax reporting, right? So now you're probably got to file an income tax return in that state, whatever annual filings they have, their LLC fees. You may get put on the radar for sales tax and other things. So it's going to trigger a whole chain of events once you do that.
Yeah, one of the things that I talk to my clients about, because I represent a lot of emerging technology companies, and I hear all the time, well, Y Combinator and Techstars requires that everybody incorporate in Delaware. So if Delaware isn't that big of a deal anymore, then why do they do that? And so to answer that question, I explained to them that they have applicants coming from all over the world and from all 50 states. And so it would be unreasonable for Techstars, Y Combinator, and some of these other more globally minded incubators and accelerator programs to have to figure out what are the little nuances among all of the individual states in order to ensure that all of the paperwork that they issue between them and these entities is compliant, right? It's just really it's cost prohibitive.
Well,
they decided, that you can't go wrong with Delaware. And so what they do is they require everybody to go ahead and then convert themselves, and they provide conversion services to make sure that everybody is a Delaware C corporation. And the Delaware C corporation model is the most flexible in order to provide for anything that could ever potentially come up in the life cycle of that potential business entity. It doesn't mean that it's the most efficient for every business entity, but it is the most flexible, the most wide-reaching, and the most understood and adhered to on a global basis, so that they can take companies in from France or Germany or Norway or South America or wherever they're operating, and they can have one business model sort of meets all potential questions. And so that's why it is the Y Combinator, Techstars, and other similarly situated organizations will choose the Delaware C corporation business model.
Yeah, it's kind of a default. And we also see this with some private equity funds, same deal, right? Rather than have to monitor 50 state laws, worry about what the unusual things are, keep up with the cases, right? Because even in states that don't have a lot of corporate filings, there will occasionally be a case, and maybe that changes how people view the law. It'd be a lot of monitoring and work for some investors if they had companies in many, many states. So a lot of them do say, just go to Delaware. And the C corporation, of course, investors like the C corporations, not because it's tax efficient, but because it's tax compartmentalized.
Yes.
So your LLC in most cases will lead to a lower amount of total tax paid, because it's a flow through. It's paid by the person who owns the company. The C corporation potentially has two layers of tax. The company pays tax, and then the owners pay tax. But we don't have what we call phantom income. So with a C corporation, you're not going to have a situation where the company's making money, the investor's showing paper profit, and therefore the investor has to write a check. That's a very difficult situation.
Money they never saw.
For some investors don't have cash sitting around, right? At some point in your fund history, you're fully deployed. You've got all your money in companies, so you don't have a checking account to pay tax bills until you liquidate the investment. So investment funds don't like to have flow through taxation.
It makes it a little bit complicated for accounting purposes to figure out what the individual tax liability is per investor, depending on what their state income and their local county, taxes might be, and it can be a little bit of a wonky sort of investment scenario. So but it's important to keep in mind that when we're talking about where you form your company and what state, that that is specific as to how your clubhouse rules operate. Your clubhouse rules is to how the directors and officers and shareholders, or members if you're an LLC, how you interact with each other, right? Who has what rights and privileges, and what happens in the case of a dispute. Because when it comes to your business, the business of running your business, whether you're a construction company, whether you're an e-commerce company or a service provider, so you're going to still have to comply with the rules of the state where you're operating in that state. So like in Florida, there was this really crazy case that came out about money service businesses that was completely out of step with FinCEN and with the other states, you know, and so it doesn't matter if you're a Delaware corporation, if you're engaged in, you know, the money service business or money transmittal business, you're going to potentially buy that case if you're operating here in the state of Florida.
Right.
So it's important to distinguish between what law applies when. It's tough. Confusing, isn't it?
It is tough. It's confusing. And then there's some random stuff out there, you know, where, you know, basically, Anessa, you know, you nailed it, right? I mean, your internal rules are generally governed by the state you're incorporated or formed in. Your external rules are generally governed by where you're operating, but there's exceptions to those rules. There's been some challenges to the internal rules. California's got a wonky rule that says if you have significant operations in California, you're going to be governed by California law, even if you aren't in California.
If you're headquartered there, right? Because they wanted to make sure that all those tech companies that are Delaware corporations, but are all headquartered in California, they want to make sure that they're abiding by California rules. And
those companies are essentially governed by two sets of rules.
Yeah,
really
but I get it though, right? Because they are substantial employers. And so California wants to make sure that the citizens and the residents of California have those protections that they as a people decided was important. Like, for example, protections against non-compete agreements.
And then, you get into stuff like non-competes, and those are generally governed by where the employee is located, you know, so, you know, it's very complicated how all this overlays each other. Which is why you got to take a case-by-case analysis, right? So we can't sit here, unlike what we joked at the beginning of the show, we can't just tell you one state is the answer.
Right. No, it's true. You know, I actually have some companies that my clients that when they hear that Florida has the greatest amount of protections for non-compete agreements in favor of the employer over the employee, which is where California is the total opposite. They favor the employee, right? They pretty much cancel out non-compete agreements. New York is somewhere in the middle, right? So that actually will influence their decision. They'll say, well, I do want to be in Florida because as an employer, I want to make sure that my trade secret information is protected above all else, right? And so they'll choose because they want to avail themselves of that particular governance that would be important to them. So it's a really specific conversation on a case-by-case basis, and that's why it depends.
Right, but there's not a blanket answer. It definitely depends. And, you know, and for small companies, to the extent that somebody out there is small listening, you're probably going to form in the state that you're operating in, right? It probably doesn't make sense. You got to have some level of sophistication and something unusual going on in order to say, hey, we got to start looking at, you know, the 50 states and figure out where we should be. And so
I agree.
Figure out what works for you, folks. Anessa, why don't you tell folks how they can follow you? I know you put a lot of great postings about the tech world and what's happening with the cryptocurrency and everything else. Why don't you tell people where they can find your work?
Sure. Look me up on LinkedIn. You can look me up on Facebook or on my website, which is Intellilaw, INTELLILAW.io.
Perfect, folks. I'm the Our Shawn. You can check me out also on LinkedIn. Check us out here at McBrideAttorneys.com. Let us know what you're learning here. What questions do you have? What issues do you have? Anessa and I will try to respond back wherever you drop it, whether it's on YouTube or if it's one of our LinkedIn feeds. And if you haven't done so yet, subscribe to the YouTube channel, ring the bell for notifications, and like this show. So thanks for joining us, everybody.
Thanks. Bye-bye.